The road to the Scottish currency. So I'm going to talk about the road to the Scottish currency. So whatever happens, and I suspect it's unlikely there's going to be another Section 30 order with the sort of 2014 style referendum, but you do need some sort of what I've called a democratic event, whether that's a general election, a Holyrood election, or whatever, it doesn't really matter, but you need some sort of decisive democratic event that can be shown to the rest of the world and to London to show that independence is the choice of the people of Scotland. So once that happens, then the UK Prime Minister will have to concede that Scotland has chosen independence. And one way of making them concede that is to have done your homework with the rest of the world, and key players such as the United States or France and Germany, etc., and have persuaded them that if the will of the people is independence, that they would support that. And then, for example, one scenario, they might go to the UK and say, well, you know, you're not very happy about it, but the people of Scotland have chosen independence, and if you agree to accept that, then we will support your application to retain your seat on the UN Security Council, for example. And if they don't agree to it, then obviously they could do the reverse and say, well, we will vote for the UK to be removed from the seat on the Security Council and have it declared vacant. We do need to work on that, but we need to have our dominoes lined up that we have done the homework with the important players around the world who will support Scottish independence. So how do we actually implement independence? The Statute of Westminster 1931. And I think simply adding Scotland to the territories to which this applies is the easiest way of starting the independence process. It's not independent. What the Statute of Westminster did was to put the Sewell Commission into law that Westminster could not change. Because the Statute of Westminster says that as of midnight on the 31st of December 1931, the Westminster Parliament, which in those days they called it the Imperial Parliament, would not pass legislation for Australia, Canada, South Africa, the Irish Free State, New Zealand, without the written consent of the parliaments of those territories. Right? So no, you say no, but we're going to ignore it, written consent. So it didn't stop Westminster carrying on passing legislation, and indeed Westminster to this very day still passes legislation for Australia, but only as it relates to the royal family. And they have to get the consent of the Australian Parliament before they can announce the official titles of Charles III. So if we just add Scotland to the Statute of Westminster, which you can do with a simple statutory instrument at Westminster, the other thing I would do is to, again, you can use a Section 30 order, and you would simply delete the appendix of reserved powers from the Scotland Act 1990. So that means that then the Scottish Parliament can start setting up, for example, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Finance, Defence Ministry, these sort of things, and all the sort of preparations that are going to be needed for independence. It's not independence, it just means we have full devolutionary control at that point. And we can, they can't stop us passing whatever legislation needs to be. We got another resolution through the SNP conference which said that the Scottish Government should, or the SNP, should draft the legislation for establishing the Reserve Bank. It was supposed to be done by the next conference and reported back on this. Just needs to be done because within a couple of weeks of this vote we need to introduce the legislation at Holyrood and start that process going through the Parliament. It probably takes a year to get the legislation in place. In 2019 there was a great deal of excitement about the 6 tests from the Growth Commission, which I comprehensively rubbished. I'm not going to sort of labour them too much today. Unfortunately, they haven't quite gone away because they just reappeared in the October 2022 Scottish Government White Paper, except they've changed their name into criteria and conditions. So they've sort of gone under a blanket, hoping that nobody would notice them sneak past. But they're still there, and they need to go. These are the things about, do we have a deficit and a debt? And every state pretty much runs a deficit most of the time. It's just the normal for independent countries, and it's how your money is created. If you don't run a deficit, then there's going to be a shortage of money in your economy. Is an independent Scotland going to have debt? No. And we are not taking a share of the UK national debt because it's also the UK national savings, and which country in their right mind hands over a share of the national savings to a foreign country? Nobody. Which is why no country, none of the 61 countries that have ever left the Empire, took any share of the UK's debt, ever. And don't tell me about Ireland, because they didn't. So, you see, I get attacked on X all the time about the, oh, but Ireland. No, that was a farm loan scheme where the farmers repaid the loans that they had. We don't have any debt, and the deficit is a normal part of London government. Do we have a credible central bank? Well, we're going to have a central bank set up, we're going to have legislation in place. Is it credible? Well, you only really know that once it's actually working. Does the currency meet the needs of the people? Well, you know, any currency meets the needs of the people. You've been spending a currency this afternoon getting your lunch. Did it meet your needs? Was the food digestible? So, yeah, it's nonsense. Do we have enough reserves? Well, you'll see later on in the talk that we accumulate those automatically. Does it fit our trade patterns? Complete nonsense. Any currency fits your trade patterns because you change your currency into whatever you need. If you're buying something from the US, you change it into dollars. Have we decoupled from the UK business cycle? Well, we're not going to decouple from the UK business cycle until such time as we're independent and until we break the link to the GB pound and have our own currency. So we'll get rid of all of that rubbish. Have a look at the sort of things that we really should be considering as we move towards having our own currency. And I've already mentioned we need to make sure we have the legislation drafted. We can do that now, and the Scottish Government's not going to do it, then the Scottish Currency Group will look at this, doing this next year, rather as part of our plans for setting up the Scottish Monetary Research Institute to start work on the currency, which will be the subject of the conference 2025. We need to make sure that we have the new notes and coins. To do proper banknotes takes around a year, I've been told. I have been contacted by several printers of banknotes looking for the contract. None from the UK, but had a French company that was actually going to send somebody to Edinburgh to discuss the project and the technical requirements and so on. I had to say, well, I'll contact you in a couple of years' time. We're not quite there yet. We need to make sure we have the payment system set up. And the suggestion is that we duplicate the ECB systems. They have one for small payments, one for large payments. They already can handle multiple currencies because they do the Danish krona, and we just have to add on a Scottish pound and use that software for our system. We need to explain to all of you what's going on, public information campaigns, so that people get very itchy about currency, and we need to make sure people are reassured, they know what's happening at every stage. We need to have the premises and the staff in place. We need financial regulation, which is important. And we need to make clear to people what's going to happen about pensions. Anyone who says that, whatever the legal technicalities or the fact that you think you have a contract or whatever, you just have to accept the reality the UK is not going to pay the state pension after Independence Day. Whether you can argue till the cows come home that you pay your national insurance and they should pay it, they're not going to. And they don't need to, actually, because the Scottish Government will take over the national insurance system. There is approximately 11 or 12 billion a year collected in national insurance from us in Scotland. It's one of the few useful things about Jersey. It actually shows how much national insurance is collected. And it also tells you how much is paid out in pensions. So a bit over 11 billion is collected and 8 billion is paid out. So, and it also covers statutory maternity pay and paternity pay and redundancy payments and statutory sick pay. And even after you pay all of those, there's 500 million left over every year. 1 year, V-Day plus 1 year, The Act receives royal assent. I did have lovely premises identified for the headquarters of the Scottish Reserve Bank, but unfortunately the Edinburgh Music School has nabbed it. So you can all put your thinking caps on and see whether you have a redundant sort of bank-style building with some nice Greek columns, which would make a suitable headquarters where the governor can be interviewed on the steps by somebody from the Scottish Broadcasting Corporation, and going to give it a nice background. So we're open for applications. The central bank will end up employing about 800 staff, so this is quite a nice thing to have wherever it's going to end up. It doesn't have to be in Edinburgh. It's going to set out the aims of the Scottish Reserve Bank, which will be under full democratic and parliamentary control. Central banks are not independent. You've been fed this rubbish about the Bank of England being independent. It is not, and it should not be. That's why it was nationalised in 1946. If you look at the mess that the Bank of England made in the 1920s and 1930s, it gives you a good idea as to why it got nationalised. But central banks are a key component of the state. The Bank of England is a wholly owned subsidiary of the UK Treasury. It does what the Treasury tells it to do if the Treasury doesn't abdicate that responsibility. If the governor doesn't do exactly what he's told, he'll get sacked. So, and profits, which are quite substantial, the surplus, probably a better way of describing it, of the Bank of England is simply paid to the Treasury. So it's a subsidiary. If you're looking at group accounting, the standard group accounting that applies to NatWest Banking Group or anything like that, the Bank of England will be netted off within the Treasury, and the 800 billion or so of bonds which are owned by the Bank of England, which are supposedly part of the UK national debt, would simply disappear in group accounting. Well, I think if you're looking at the policies that the central bank should follow, full employment would be a good thing. This is not exactly very radical, because this is a requirement of the US Federal Reserve to maintain full employment in the United States. The Bank of England is not required to do anything at all except control inflation, and the main reason for that is to preserve the wealth of those who have lots of GB pounds. So what actually happens in a practical sense? The banks would write to their Scottish customers, inviting you to open a Scottish pound account. Now, you don't have to. And it's very important to realise that the Scottish pound will be 100% voluntary. Nobody has to change anything if they don't want to. And the default position, if you ignore all the letters, ignore all the emails and text messages and all the rest of it, is that your position will stay exactly as it is. Nothing will be converted. You will retain your existing GB pound account and whatever's in them, and you will not get a Scottish account. People who have a connection with Scotland, who want a Scottish account, if you're working in Dubai and you're going to come back, you can just ask for one. Companies, probably in most cases, unlike me, which we deal with people in England as well as those in Scotland, we probably have two accounts. We keep a Scottish account for our Scottish customers and we have an English account for the English customers. Standard practice in Canada. Most Canadian companies, they do credit card payments in US dollars, they do them in Canadian dollars. It's not a big deal these days. We need to make sure we have the designs and so on finalised for the notes, get them manufactured. I think we should have a national competition, put up a decent prize, sort of £50,000 or something for the first prize, and get people involved. Schools can come up with designs, graphic designers, artists, whatever, all come up with designs. Get people involved, and once you can do that now. Once you're involved with designing notes, you're not a no voter. You start planning for what's going to happen after independence. You've made that decision. I'd say approximately 3 years as a transition period between whenever the democratic event takes place and actual Independence Day. And I am recommending, it's just my choice, that St Andrew's Day would be a good day to make into the future Independence Day. So, will attend an Edinburgh Castle. The banks will start posting out your new account details. So, you know, if you ask for a debit card, credit card, whether they come through the post, you'll get the internet banking details, all of that sort of stuff. And as at the moment when your card's about to expire, it won't work immediately. It'll say, you know, to be used from 1st of February or something like that. And as happened with the euro, I was talking to somebody earlier who bought one of the souvenir packs that were issued just before the euro came into force. You know, you'd be able to go to the post office or your bank, you'd be able to pick up a, you know, one of each pack of the new, whatever notes and coins are going to be. I think we shouldn't go all digital. You know, you just heard about Boots in Dunfermline who couldn't do any card payments because the machine had gone down. And makes a very fragile system if you rely 100% on digital. People often talk to me from the no side, oh, but everyone's going to move their money out of Scotland. Well, no, they're not, because we're going to do it for them. After Scotland introduces the Scottish pound, the link between Scotland and the Bank of England's payment systems will end. You know, anyone who says, oh, that we can just use the GB pound, England can't stop us, well, they actually can. They can't stop you using those coins, but they can just switch you off from the payment system. You know, they did that with Russia. After the link is broken, then sterling or GB pounds, I prefer to call it GB pounds, it would not be able to stay in the Scottish bank because it relies on being connected to the Bank of England and being under the regulation of the Bank of England. So if you already have an account at a bank which is legally English, so let's say Santander UK, nothing's going to happen because it's already an English bank. If you happen to have an account at the Royal Bank of Scotland, the Clydesdale Bank trading as Virgin Money, or the Bank of Scotland, they are legally Scottish banks. For example, RBS PLC is still a Scottish bank, publishes its own account. It's about 11% of the NatWest banking group. So it's owned by NatWest Bank, but it's legally a Scottish bank, still based at St Andrews Square in Edinburgh. All of their GB pound accounts will be moved to an English subsidiary, so they'll probably just become NatWest accounts, but they keep the same sort code and account number. So you won't notice that. It's just a legal change of domicile. It means that your GB pounds stay as they are, they stay under the authorisation of the Bank of England, if you've asked for it. Is at the same time as your, say, RBS account moves to RBS England PLC, you'll have a new RBS Scotland account. And if you've asked to get to acquire some Scottish pounds or convert all your money, then what you had in the GB pound account, let's say you had £500, that would be sold to the Scottish Reserve Bank, who would issue 500 Scottish pounds, which will go into a new bank account. Vending machines get converted, so after what I'm calling currency day, it won't accept the UK coins after it's converted. Cash machines will get converted as well, so when you go along to the cash machine to ask to take money out, you're not going to get GB pounds, you'll get Scottish pounds. Your GB pounds get sold to the central bank. Well, they do, because they'll disappear. There's approximately 200 billion that we all have. That's your savings account, your cash ISA, the Fife Council spending account, the Scottish Government's account, companies' accounts, all of that sort of stuff. About 200 billion. If we assume that people are canny, they don't convert at all immediately, we consider the position 2 years after the currency comes into use. Let's say people have held on to 20 billion of GB pounds, so 180 billion has been converted into Scottish pounds. Now you also have some money going the other way because liabilities need to be removed, so that's your loans. So your mortgage, your credit card debt, personal loans, those sort of things. So those are going the other way. So what happens, for example, with the mortgage, and bear in mind mortgages are a minority of interest. A lot of the ex-people talk about mortgages as if they were the most important thing on the planet. 2/3 of Scottish households do not have a mortgage. Mortgages are a rather sort of middle-class preoccupation. You've got 1/3 who are not in a position of being able to own a house at all and they're stuck in rented accommodation. You've got 1/3, which is mostly the more elderly population who own their house without a mortgage. You've got 1/3 who have a mortgage. So if you have a mortgage, all you need to do is tell the bank you want a new Scottish pound mortgage. So they give you, let's say you have a £100,000 mortgage, they grant you a £100,000 Scottish pound mortgage. They take the 100,000 Scottish pounds, they use it to repay the £100,000 English pound mortgage, which is now repaid, and you've got a Scottish pound mortgage instead. There are about 75 billion of mortgages, so they would be repaid, so take that off. The rest of the loans and so forth all come to around about, we estimate, about 130 billion. Take that off the 180 billion that's coming in, the central bank ends up with approximately 50 billion of GB pounds, which becomes the foreign reserves of Scotland. So all these people are saying, oh, you haven't got reserves, you haven't got reserves. Well, we have, you've already got them. You're just going to hand them in and change them to something else. So, don't believe me? Look at the Bank of Botswana website where it explains about the introduction of the pula in 1976. And it says that when they replaced the South African rand, which is the all-powerful currency with their giant next-door neighbour, the IMF told them they were too small and too poor and too backward to have their own currency. And they said, no, we're going to do it anyway. And those rands became the first foreign reserves of Botswana. And have they looked back? No, they've overtaken South Africa in terms of income per capita. They're now one of the wealthiest countries in Africa, but $8,500 per capita. They've got a sovereign wealth fund, about $2 billion, about the same size as Ferrers has got. And they've never looked back. So anyway, that's the final part. So we end up with all those reserves. If you think the UK has vast reserves, no it doesn't, it has about $75 billion. So Scotland would end up with not far short of the same foreign reserves as the UK's got. If you liquidated the GB pound, you'd get less than 2 US cents in the pound. So the new currency is now on public sale. Debit and credit cards go live. You can still carry on using your GB pound ones if you want. We're now in what's called the exchange period, when the two currencies are pegged one-to-one and you can change freely between them without any charges. The Scottish Government stopped accepting GB pounds and it will stop making payments in GB pounds. So if you work in the public sector, which is nearly 50% of the Scottish economy, so that's the health service, police, councils, central government, all of that sort of stuff, all of that's going to convert straight away into using the Scottish pounds. Now, if you work in the Scottish Health Service, you're not going to have a choice, you're going to be paid in Scottish pounds. If you're in the private sector, it's up to your employer. So, if you work for Bailey Gifford, if they want to pay you in GB pounds, then they can do that. After about, say, 15 weeks, sort of 3 or 4 months, then the exchange period would come to an end, and the banks will start charging you if you use a GB pound card. So if you go to Spain and use a debit card, you get 2.5%. That will then apply to people who carry on using the GB pound in Scotland. So in a way, I say it's all voluntary, but it's not really. It's a system of sticks and carrots that will ensure that within a fairly short space of time, people just move over to the new currency. Within a year or two, they'll have forgotten about the GB pound. Foreign exchange trading would start, and I think we will then move to a position of what's called managed bands. So the central bank would say we'll allow the Scottish pound to fluctuate against the GB pound by plus minus 1%. And then if that's all working okay, after a couple of months you can say we'll go make the band a bit bigger, we'll go to plus minus 2% and maybe 5%. And eventually perhaps we will decide we could just have a floating currency, which most economists say, well, floating currency is probably best. But that's an argument you can have in the future. So after a year, I'm going to say that the currency's gone up slightly against the GB pound. That's not because I think that the Scottish pound is going to be, particularly a strong currency. I think it's because the GB pound is going to be a weak currency. 1947, my mother, she came from quite a posh family, was sent off to Switzerland, to Lausanne, for a year in a Swiss finishing school for young ladies where you learned how to cook and how to lay the table properly. And in those days, you got 25 Swiss francs per pound. But they also had exchange controls, so you got a foreign exchange allowance of £25 for the year per person. So you had to get special permission to pay the school fees, for example. 25 Swiss francs per pound. Today you get 1 Swiss franc per pound. For anyone who tells you that the GB pound is a wonderful thing. Take the US dollar, it used to be $4.86 to a pound. And today I think it's $1.27 or 28 or something like that. So the pound has steadily lost value over the last century. And I just think it will carry, especially with Scotland gone, I think it will carry on going down. So that's my logic there. We'll be implementing the Green New Deal. I put down a figure of about 10 billion a year to be invested in it. With the central bank, then we can start doing things like, say, the investment bank issues a bond, which is bought by the central bank, which finances the investment. After all the sort of shock horror, you can't have direct monetary financing and blah, 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 the European Union eventually decided that it was permissible for the European Investment Bank to issue bonds and for the European Central Bank to buy them. So even they came round to that idea. As I said, the central bank could accumulate 50 billion of foreign reserves. That, just to be technical about it, that goes into what's called a central bank reserve account, which would be at the Bank of England. These are central bank reserves, or what's called base money. It's not possible for them to leave the Bank of England. So they would move accounts. So the 32 billion which the Royal Bank has on deposit at the Bank of England in its last account would have, because they've now no longer got the GB pound accounts, everyone customers have converted to Scottish pounds. That means effectively that 32 billion has moved across to the account of the Scottish Reserve Bank, but it's still in the Bank of England. We wouldn't want to keep all our foreign reserves in GB pounds. So one of the first things we're going to do is to sell some of those and acquire US dollars, euros, yen, maybe even buy some gold. And we're going, we should have done this years ago.